This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 586 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We've got earlier games than usual this week, so I wanted to get this out as soon as I possibly could. That's why it's dropping on Wednesday rather than Thursday. Regarding last week on this show, though, I think it was a decent one for the sleeper show, but not everything went right. Like, Daniel Jones was a bad, deeper streamer, but he wasn't my top streamer, at least. Most of the 25 to 50% rostered players actually didn't pan out very well. Deontay Foreman didn't see the game script that I was hoping he'd see, Tyler Conklin didn't take advantage of a great matchup, and Robbie Anderson only scored 8 PPR points. He did have a 22% target share, though, so the process wasn't that bad for him. I made a very, very big mistake by saying that Kirk Cousins was more of a borderline start. And Wayne Gallman, who I didn't really like on the show that much, but Wayne Gallman didn't see nearly the kind of workload that he could have seen without Cordarrelle Patterson. But as usual, there were some good hits, too. Tua was a fine streamer, Jamison Crowder had a nice day in a good slot matchup, Adam Troutman was great, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling had one of the best games of his career. And Emmanuel Sanders and Zach Moss didn't do a whole lot, and I had both of them as sits. Now, I do want to address one thing about this show really quickly, especially as we approach the fantasy playoffs, where our start-sit decisions are even more important. I go over my hits and misses at the start of each episode because I think it's important to be transparent. I don't ever want to be the analyst who just focuses on the hits and ignores the misses, because that doesn't help any of us get better. I could sit on here and talk about throwing Javonte Williams into your starting lineup, but I just don't think that's helpful. I want to dig deeper with these picks in order to help more people out. So yes, I'm going to miss a lot on this show. I'm talking about players on this show that no one wants in fantasy football. And since we're talking deep plays, the players I talk about are not automatic starts. There have been some people who have been angry at me on social media over the last couple of weeks because they started a player from this show over a more established player, when I never said to do that. This show is about information, and it's about finding players who you may want to start if you're in a pinch. Now, as always, if you have a very specific start-sit question, if you listen to this show and you have a question about this show, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'll gladly answer. Or you can tune into my start-sit show on FanDuel's YouTube channel every Sunday at noon Eastern. I answer literally over 100 start-sit questions on that show. Now, before getting into sleepers this week, as I said yesterday, FanDuel is partnering with EA Sports to bring you this week's NFL Sunday Million contest. Enter the NFL Sunday Million Marquee Contest presented by EA Sports Madden NFL 22 this weekend and compete for your chance at a share of the $1.5 million prize pool. Simply build your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold. Kickoff is right around the corner, so head to FanDuel.com and get in the game today. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. Now, this first tier, as always, is players that are rostered in 25% to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And one quarterback who's in that group who I like as a streamer this week is Jimmy Garoppolo. He's actually averaged over 19 fantasy points per game over his last 4, and he hasn't scored fewer than 15 points in over a month. The 49ers generally take a conservative approach. That's why you see pass attempt totals of 19 and 22 from Garoppolo over his last 2 games. But they may not be able to do that against Minnesota. The 49ers are only 3-point favorites in that game, and that game has a decent over-under of 49 according to FanDuel Sportsbook. That gives San Francisco a nice team total. Minnesota is also not a bad matchup. They've been the friendliest team to wide receivers in adjusted points allowed this year, and they've been the 10th friendliest team to quarterbacks. So Jimmy G, given the offense around him, this matchup, and his recent performances, I think he makes sense. If Sterling Shepard doesn't go this week, I really don't mind Kadarius Toney. I know the matchup doesn't look good on paper because of how well Philadelphia's defended wide receivers in fantasy, but they'll give you the underneath stuff. That's where Toney can do work. But he's rostered in a little over 50% of leagues right now. So instead, you could look to his tight end, Evan Ingram. Ingram's just been getting some cardio recently on a football field. He's running by far the most tight end routes for New York, but he's averages 4 targets per game over his last 3. I think he could see more volume this week given the matchup. Philly is 3rd in adjusted target share allowed to tight ends this year, and they're 1st in adjusted points allowed. That means we should expect Ingram to be a little bit better than usual this week. Another tight end streamer, Dan Arnold. Yes, I'm going to go back to Arnold after he burned absolutely everyone last week. The good news for Arnold is that last week he still ran the second most routes on the Jags. Now there's no Jamal Agnew, so there's some potential to see a little bit more volume. But more importantly, Jacksonville gets Atlanta. Atlanta's been a pretty average matchup for tight ends this year, but it's at least a matchup where Jacksonville, just as a team in general, might be able to move the ball a little bit better than they typically do. We have a larger sample size of Dan Arnold seeing 20% target share game after 20% target share game. The peripherals are still there for Arnold, so I think he's fine as a streamer. And then on that same team is Laviska Shenault. I talked about Shenault on the 10 Trend show where I noted that he spent more time in the slot last week because of Jamal Agnew's injury. And honestly, the slot is where he belongs. From weeks 1 through 4, which is with DJ Chark for a large portion, Shenault played 82% of his snaps from the slot according to Pro Football Focus. Since then, the numbers dropped to 33%. He's also seen his target share per game drop by about 3 percentage points. Without Jamal Agnew, I think we see Shenault in the slot more. And Atlanta's been an above average matchup for slot receivers this year. It's tough to put a lot of faith in the Jags offense, but at least there's reason to be more optimistic about Laviska Shenault now. And then the final player, or I guess players in this tier, is Ty Johnson. Because spoiler alert, I was going to talk about Tevin Coleman in the next tier of players. Because we just don't know for sure how this backfield is going to be split without Michael Carter. But I'll just talk about the situation in general here. Coleman played as many snaps as Ty Johnson last week. He actually out-touched him. I would expect Coleman to probably take on more early down work, and maybe that's more attractive to you because the Jets actually have a beatable opponent this week in the Texans. Not only is the spread close at just 2.5 points, but Houston's allowed the 10th most adjusted fantasy points to opposing running backs this year. I just think Ty Johnson offers more upside. He's already been catching passes out of the backfield, and he'll probably see at least some early down work as well. So he'll get the higher quality touches for fantasy more consistently. And he also is less likely to be game scripted out. Both players aren't necessarily optimal plays, despite this matchup. But I know a lot of you are in trouble at running back. Coleman might be easier to trust in the standard league, and then Ty Johnson in PPR. But I think in general, Johnson's just a little bit safer. Okay, let's officially move on to this tier, which consists of players rostered in 10 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, and let's start with Cedric Wilson. If CeeDee Lamb doesn't go on Thanksgiving, Cedric Wilson should be in store for about a 20% target share. In Week 11 against Kansas City without Lamb for half of that game, Wilson tied Noah Brown for the second most routes run for Dallas. He saw about 17% of the team's targets. Dallas has a nice implied team total in this game, and Wilson would be an easy way to get a piece of that offense, as long as CeeDee Lamb is out. I just don't know that at the time of this recording. Now, I was thinking about going Russell Gage with this next pick, but I'm pivoting to Kendrick Bourne because I trust this situation more. And that's not something I expected to say at the start of the season. Bourne was a wide receiver 4 last week after scoring 9 PPR points, but he once again hit a 15% target share for New England. He's averaged a target share per game of 18.5% over his last 4 games, when that average was 11% across his first 7. Now he gets Tennessee, a team that's allowed the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers this year. I think Bourne is sort of in that wide receiver 4 discussion once again this week, so I can understand how or why someone could use him. Jordan Howard is expected to be out against the Giants this week, and that's good news for Miles Sanders, but it's also good news for Boston Scott. The Eagles are averaging almost 31 running back rush attempts per game over their last 4. And only one running back, Jordan Howard back in Week 9 against the Chargers, only one running back has exceeded a 50% running back rush share in a single game. Howard saw 31% of the team's running back rushes this past week with Miles Sanders back, and because Philly's been splitting this backfield up, I'd expect Boston Scott to see a chunk of that. So if Scott is in that 30 to 35% running back rush share range, if they continue to run their running backs at a high rate, you're looking at a potential 8 to 12 carries for Scott with a target or 2 through the air. And I'd expect them to go with a pretty run-heavy approach against the Giants because New York, they rank 7th in adjusted points allowed to running backs. They haven't been very good against the run. Now, the unfortunate part of doing this show during the week is that we learn more about injuries over the weekend. So we have to play some hypotheticals. If Jerry McNichols doesn't go, Dontrell Hilliard is a decent PPR option. And if McNichols does go, I think he's an interesting option. I do think McNichols is going to serve as a team's pass-catching back. But adding Hilliard right now isn't a bad idea after Adrian Peterson was released. But it's a role that could be interesting this week. Not only is Tennessee hurting at pass catcher, but New England ranks 4th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs this season. Hilliard saw 20% of the team's targets last week, and we've seen McNichols this season with that kind of spiked week as well. So pay close attention to reports, because the satellite back for Tennessee could be a decent PPR option this week. Finally, there's the tier of players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues, and let's talk about another quarterback streamer, Tyrod Taylor. He's still rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues, but he gets a Jets defense this week that's allowed 17.5 fantasy points to every quarterback they've faced since week 3. They're second in adjusted points allowed to the position. We saw Taylor have a nice outing last week despite only throwing for 107 yards in a bad weather game. He ran the ball 6 times, he found the end zone twice on the ground. He's now rushed for 20 or more yards in 3 of his 4 starts this year. The matchup is there. The upside is there with his rushing. So I think he works as a deep sleeper. In that same offense is Rex Burkhead. And Burkhead could now have more of that backfield to himself because Phillip Lindsay is no longer in the picture. Burkhead actually saw about 56% of the team's running back rushes last week. But that was Lindsay's role back in week 9. Now without Lindsay, there's more stability for Rex Burkhead. And they get the Jets. New York has been terrible defensively this year, and that's especially true against running backs. They're the best matchup for opposing backs in adjusted points allowed. If Houston can find a positive game script, which is actually possible this week, Rex Burkhead could pay off. And then the last deep play this week, I want to give you at least some sort of deeper Thanksgiving Day play. So I'm going to talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown. I wouldn't come close to playing St. Brown if Jared Goff is out. I don't even think a lot of you need to come close to starting him with Jared Goff playing. But the matchup is definitely there. The last time I called Amon-Ra St. Brown out was 2 weeks ago against Pittsburgh. And while he had 61 yards receiving on 4 catches, nothing special, that accounted for 54% of Detroit's receiving yards that day. They just only threw for 114 yards. It was because he had a good slot matchup, and he has another good one this week against Chicago. This season, the Bears are second in target share allowed to the slot, and they're third in receiving yards allowed to the slot. That's where St. Brown plays. St. Brown has seen target shares of 16%, 25%, and 17% over his last 3. And since week 3, he's averaged a target share per game of about 18%. He's a super, super deep play, but the matchup at least is there. Let's talk about some players who are rostered in 75% or more of leagues who you could consider sitting this week. Ryan Tannehill is absolutely one of them. I don't know how you can trust him. He's got banged up receivers, obviously no Derrick Henry, and New England's been impressive against quarterbacks this year. Aside from week 5 and 6, where Davis Mills and Dak Prescott finished as high-end QB1s against them, they haven't allowed a single QB1 performance. They've allowed just 1 double-digit point performance since that time. That's why they rank second best in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. So I don't like Tannehill at all this week. I would start Jimmy Garoppolo over him. Now, I mentioned Courtland Sutton a lot on this show, but once again, he's a sit. He's averages 3 targets per game since Jerry Jeudy's return from injury, and he gets a minus matchup against the Chargers, or at least a neutral one at best. You just got to wait until you see something before you can confidently start him. And similar to that line of thinking, I'd do the same with Odell Beckham. We don't know what his usage is really going to look like in this offense. And his matchup against Green Bay, a team that's done well against wide receivers this year, it's not good enough to warrant you forcing OBJ into your lineup. So I would wait another week. Don't play someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown over him, but definitely know there's a lot of volatility there. Zach Moss is still rostered in 75% of leagues. I would bench him for obvious reasons. Mainly the fact that Matt Breida has been their top back over the last 2 weeks. And then lastly, this one's a little bit tougher, but I'm going to say Damian Harris. At least temper expectations. With Ramondre Stevenson getting more work in New England's backfield, the last time we saw Harris, he saw his lowest running back rush share of the season. Tennessee's a team that you can throw on better than running on them. They actually rank 4th best in adjusted points allowed to running backs this year. Harris should see maybe 10 to 12 touches, but I don't think that he's a lock for that much more. As for the streaming defenses this week, I already talked about Chicago on the 15 Transactions show. They work, but they're now rostered in a lot more leagues. If you couldn't get them, I'm cool with Philly against the Giants. And if you want to dig even deeper than that, how about Jacksonville against Atlanta? The Jags are actually top 10 in pressure rate this year, and Atlanta's been the best matchup for opposing defenses in adjusted points allowed. That's skewed a bit by last week's game against New England, but they were still top 5 entering that game. So I think the Jags are a sneaky start this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I won't be doing a mailbag episode this week because of the holiday, so I hope everyone has an awesome Thanksgiving. Enjoy family, friends, enjoy football. I'll talk to you next week.